Good evening. In a landmark ruling, the Supreme Court today legalized abortions. The majority in cases from Texas and Georgia said that the decision to end a pregnancy during the first 3 months belongs to the woman and her doctor, not the government. Thus, the anti-abortion laws of 46 states were rendered unconstitutional. More on this story from George Herman.
The 9 justices made abortion largely a private matter and ordered the states to make no laws forbidding it, except possibly during the final months. The court split 7-2, with Justices Byron White and William Rehnquist dissenting. The newly liberalized abortion law brought immediate reaction.
I think that to raise the dignity of woman and give her freedom of choice in this area is an extraordinary event. And I think that January 22nd, 1973 would be an historic day.
In this instance, the Supreme Court has withdrawn protection for the human rights of unborn children, and it is teaching people that abortion is a rather innocuous procedure provided that there are proper legal safeguards. I think that the judgment of the court will do a great deal to tear down the respect previously accorded.
The UK is seeing its first rise in crime rates for more than a decade. Figures from the Office of National Statistics show overall crime has risen by 6%, with violent offences jumping 27%. But most shockingly, the number of sexual attacks rose 36% to a staggering 99,609, the highest number ever recorded.
We have an upsurge in gang crimes, youngsters using knives and guns. We have the phenomenon of alcohol and drug abuse, people getting out of their heads at a weekend, getting involved in violence. And another contributory factor is the fact that the police have been cut back so dramatically.
The Conservative government is being criticised in their handling of the police. Shadow Policing Minister Jack Dromey did not agree with the Tories' decision to reduce the number of police officers by 17,000.
Critics are saying the rise in crime rates in England and Wales is a massive concern, and many believe the police force here is just far too stretched and simply cannot deal with a number of offences that are now taking place.
Machines that once pumped oil from the ground near Alice, Texas sit idle, lined up along a highway.
I didn't want to look at it.
It's a painful sight for Denise Walker Robinson.
And I think that's what keeps me going is my faith.
Her company services oil rigs, but these trucks have nowhere to go. She once had 200 employees. Now there are only 48.
That means that I'm struggling to keep those 48 people working.
If prices don't stabilize this year, what happens to your business?
Well, we may all be done.
Cheaper oil means it's less profitable to drill here, and as projects dry up, the town has suffered. Sales tax revenues plummeted more than 60% in 1 year. Unemployment has nearly doubled to 9%. Jesus Trevino lost his job moving oil equipment 6 months ago and went to a food pantry today for help.
Can't even afford to pay my bills. You know, you go from making a good living, and all of a sudden it's all gone.
And your address?
Volunteer Phyllis Seidel says the pantry's caseload grew by 700 people last year.
Are you concerned about being able to handle that?
Yes, very.
For 14 centuries, St. Elijah's Monastery in Mosul, Iraq stood for peace and faith, hosting worshipers from around the world. But these newly obtained satellite images confirm the monastery was standing when ISIL militants took over the area in 2014, only to be ground to powder just 1 month later.
There's nothing left. Small piles of rocks, perhaps, but nothing that would look like the monastery.
Our Christian history leveled in a barbaric way.
Reverend Paul Thabit Habib can hardly believe the monastery in his hometown of Mosul is gone.
All the poets, historians, and travelers who wrote about this monastery, they described the priests, the atmosphere inside. It became a very important place for the history of the church in Iraq.
The destruction is the latest victim of ISIL militants. Last year, ISIL released video showing the destruction of Hatra in Iraq, a UNESCO heritage site from the time of Alexander the Great. In 2014, they featured another attack in Mosul, justifying the attacks as part of protecting their interpretation of Islam. What they don't destroy, they sell, earning income for their so-called caliphate.
They're benefiting not only from the sale, but also just from the trade itself.
Suzanne Bott helped restore St. Elijah's Monastery when she worked as a U.S. State Department cultural advisor. She says the result is the same, a loss for generations to come.
They will never be able to stand in these locations and experience the feeling of looking around and seeing what our ancestors were able to do.
The faculty at Wheaton College is telling the school not to fire a controversial professor who has been defending Islam. The Christian college has initiated the termination process against Larisha Hawkins, but the faculty council is unanimously opposing that idea. Hawkins made headlines when she put on an Islamic headscarf and publicly argued that Christians and Muslims worship the same God. College officials say they began the effort to fire Hawkins because she refused to participate in clarifying conversations about theology. Hawkins says that she will still pursue reconciliation with Wheaton.
For Ruben Capizano, father to a 3-year-old boy,
I feel extremely relieved.
Relief after a rare conviction.
I'm going to sue you.
This was Daniel Lackey dodging our questions in November after Mickey Payne
takes a picture of her as she bends over.
Says he snapped photos of children at her yard sale in Claremont. She told her story only to 10 News. I then confirmed Lackey's identity, a sex offender registered as homeless. After our story, tips poured in from a neighborhood in Serra Mesa.
You see his truck there in the afternoon, and in the morning his truck is there.
Neighbors told me the man who claimed to be homeless had actually lived in this home for years.
If you live here, why are you registering as homeless?
He wasn't talking, but neighbors did. I took their statements to police, who opened up an investigation. Months later, a rare conviction for lying about his living situation, made possible.
We live here, we see things.
After neighbors from 2 communities spoke out. The head of the region's sex offender task force calls homeless offenders our nightmare. Of the more than 4,400 sex offenders in the county, 557 are registered as homeless.
Well, it scares me a lot because they can pretty much be unwatched.
Even if they lie about their residency, it's usually hard to prove, with about 15 to 20 prosecutions a year. Numbers that could go up if neighbors keep watch.
We'll be able to have an impact on our safety and the safety of our children.
Michael Chen, 10 News.
Homeless sex offenders have to register every 30 days and have to supply a zip code, but they're easy to miss on the Megan's Law website and can move about freely between registrations. Lackey faces up to a year in jail.
The manhunt continues for 3 escaped inmates in Southern California. They broke out of a maximum security jail in Santa Ana on Friday. As Mireya Villarreal reports, they are considered armed and dangerous.
We will not stop until these individuals are back in our custody.
Authorities say Jonathan Tu, Bak Duong, and Hussein Nayeri may have spent months planning their daring escape from the Orange County Jail. Sheriff Sandra Hutchins.
It appears to be a very sophisticated operation.
The planning was meticulous, says Sheriff Lieutenant Jeff Halleck.
It seems that the inmates cut through half-inch steel bars, cut their way through the plumbing tunnels, and ultimately gained access to an unsecure area of the roof. From the roof, the inmates rappelled down to the ground.
Authorities say it's likely they used bed sheets and other clothing to fashion a makeshift rope. As to what tools they used to escape, how they got them, or if they had help, all those questions got the same response.
We are still looking into that.
They're also looking at whether a disturbance inside the jail just prior to the nightly head count may have been a ruse by other inmates to help the 3 men escape. And now, says Sheriff Hutchins, there's a more immediate concern.
We have notified the victims of some of these crimes and the people that investigated those crimes to ensure that everybody who was involved in these cases is safe.
Authorities don't believe they've left the country. They say tips have poured in, but so far, no confirmed sightings.
Movies like Blood Diamond put the deadly trade in luxury gems on the radar, with children often the most vulnerable victims of forced labor. The reality is that some items we now take for granted are bearing the pain of illegal child labor. Well, a new report has found that very young children are working in mines to supply some of the world's most famous household names. Daniel Renches has the story.
In the Democratic Republic of Congo, these informal mine sites are unregulated and at constant risk of collapse. Now, investigators working for Amnesty International have found out that children as young as 7 are mining and are being exposed to toxic dust and other hazards.
You're talking about being involved in the backbreaking work of digging, sorting, breaking up, and then washing the stones and then delivering them to a middleman. They're not being educated. They're basically doomed to a life of indentured service in some ways, or servitude. So it's not just unethical. It's really very, very inhumane in terms of what the children are being forced to do.
Cobalt ore goes through a complex supply chain, from the miners onto a processing center run by a subsidiary of Huayu Cobalt.
Behind every product, there is LG Chem.
To lithium-ion battery makers in Asia, like LG Chem, and into products made by 16 multinationals, including Apple, Samsung, Sony, Microsoft, and the car maker VW.
This is a business enterprise. It's happening. It's not happening in conflict. It's happening as a result of negligence, of a failure to ask 1 or 2 extra questions. And I think that that's probably what's really the disgrace.
Only one of the 16 multinationals admits doing business with Huayu Cobalt. Some of the companies say they will now be doing more investigating. Others say the complexity of the supply chain makes it difficult for them to know what's going on. But the economic disparities in the DRC also need to be addressed, according to Holly Dranginis of the Enough Project.
These children and families need economic opportunity. They need their basic needs met. And once that starts to be put in place, you know, first and foremost by the government, local governments, national government in Congo, and with external partners, then we might start seeing a reduction in this.
Amnesty International says simply that companies are not checking whether children are mining cobalt for their smartphones and car batteries.